Hello, welcome to this week's Soccer 1010 lecture, and this week we're talking about culture and media. So I'll be breaking this up into four parts. First part's thinking about culture, the media and capitalism. Second part is the media and popular culture. Third part is about consumer culture and capitalism. And the fourth part about culture and identity. So let's get on with part one, thinking about culture, the media and capitalism. So as I think I said in an earlier lecture, culture is kind of one of those really difficult terms to define. It kind of can mean so much. It's such a broad thing and encapsulates so much of our the way that we live and the things that we kind of know. We've discussed it in the course through the lens of socialization and also through the lens of kind of nature and nurture debates. So certainly culture is something that we're kind of born into and kind of becomes a way of life, a way of seeing the world. We engage with what's normal and abnormal through that lens. This particularly relies on, things of like shared traditions, languages, knowledges, recognition of various values and stuff like that. Particularly historically, religious beliefs have played a real role in terms of the establishment of cultures. And so culture very broadly can be defined as kind of beliefs, traditions, practices that we kind of in some ways unite us, but in other ways divide us as well. The experience of culture is probably almost best understood as at an individual level is when you kind of step out of your comfort zone, when you kind of go into another culture, a kind of fish out of the water kind of feeling where all of a sudden you're exposed to kind of very different practices, maybe very different eating habits, even things like, cars driving on the other side of the road. We kind of get very habitual in terms of our own culture. And so I know that when I go to Europe, I always tend to look the wrong way and almost get run over every time I'm crossing the road for the first few days at least. So this kind of sense is a kind of way that things become ingrained in us, becomes normal, and therefore when you kind of engage with things that are kind of more abnormal, you have all kinds of different feelings about that, and they're often, you can kind of feel fear or you can be offended or whatever. This is obviously borne out in kind of examples like, food practices as well that I think I spoke about earlier in the course. So culture is a very important sociological factor. We've talked about it in the sociological imagination. Durkheim, one of the kind of founding fathers that we talked about earlier in the course, saw religion as being central to this in terms of how societies function. Religion kind of reinforced bonds for people, for like-minded people, linked to kind of supernatural kind of understandings of how humans evolved. But also, obviously, this means that like people of the same religion kind of had this kind of effervescence and collectivity together, but not so much when it comes to the attitudes to people with other religions. So therefore you can see the way cultures, religions, traditions both unite and divide. As societies became more secular, sociologists started to kind of see religion type activities in non-religious things. So some of those kind of symbolic, ritualistic, celebratory factors of such things like sports fandom or going to a gig or being a fan of a particular actor or celebrity, getting involved in community kind of things, were shown to kind of share some of the collective effervescence that Durkheim talked about that was about religion. So sociologists have broadened that kind of collectivity, the kind of joy and conviviality we feel with like-minded people doing things that we enjoy together, to understand things beyond religion and into things like sports fandom and stuff like that. But importantly here, the kind of collective effervescence that people experience when they do things together, for instance, I'll talk about punk cultures later, also a kind of exclusionary in the sense that there's often kind of ritualistic, symbolic things that you need to do to be part of that in-group. And therefore, if you're not doing that, and if you don't look like that, or you don't behave in a certain way, or don't have particular beliefs, there's going to be exclusionary and discriminatory and marginalising kind of things that go on there. This is particularly the case in kind of powerful discursive levels. If we hark back to Foucault here, in the ways that kind of the more powerful get to exclude through dominating the way that things like knowledge and truth are produced. So it's an important way to think about this. What I'm moving there, what I'm moving towards here is the kind of notion of ideology, particularly from a Marxist perspective. Sociologists influencing that kind of critical condition tend to see these cultural formations supporting particular power structures. And in the kind of Marxist realm, it's supporting capitalism. In this sense, our culture, and particularly pop culture, that I'll go into in a sec, is seen as a key disseminator of ideology. Ideology being kind of what ways of life and beliefs that kind of advantage the ruling class. So we'll go into those kind of class relations in future weeks when we do the week on class. Some of those earlier sociologists, when it comes to culture as well, were interested in kind of the civilizing notion of culture, and also how consumption, how the things we kind of eat and buy and do are also interesting in terms of thinking about how culture works, how it sets up norms, and how we express ourselves through our tastes and morals in particular. Elias's really incredible work, it's really interesting, and I highly suggest you check this kind of stuff out, about how the kind of development of things like manners and rituals in terms of the way people eat, various social expectations and conventions, particularly around the management of kind of bodily functions and fluids, developed throughout kind of previous centuries. There's that great quote there, "Belch thou near no man's face with corrupt fumosity, for that swerves from courtesy." You've probably seen kind of versions of this in various pop culture, and particularly satire of it in pop culture as well. So while we kind of don't want, people kind of throwing their bodily fluids at us, Elias points out that much of what was going on here was not necessarily about being hygienic or even being nice, but it was about creating kind of exclusionary status-based rules that kind of excluded the so-called masses, particularly rich people in these societies were kind of disgusted by those below them, and then kind of increasingly developed these rules to kind of exclude them. So they're civilizing in the sense that, like, it seems to be people are being more nice and more hygienic, but Elias points out that this wasn't really the motivation for that kind of stuff. This is what kind of class boundaries were being drawn through these things. And you can kind of see this too, like I would say, in examples when, so-called civilized people get together by themselves, I don't know, like in parties or whatever, and are kind of often behaving in quite vulgar ways, particularly when there's alcohol involved. But again, there's kind of this exclusionary nature that if you're doing it with like-minded people, it's, you're more civilized or whatever, you're not kind of mixing with those below you. Veblen was interested in conspicuous consumption that was kind of rising in the late 19th century as people started to kind of display their wealth more, and there was this kind of increasing, as capitalism developed, this increasing divide between old money and new money, where those kind of with new money were seen as being vulgar. So again, there's kind of really interesting distinctions going on even between the ruling class here. So these kind of examples show how cultures change over time. They don't remain static. They develop and change in relation to all kinds of different social relations, new technologies. So it's important to think as culture as not just being this static thing that we're all kind of born into and then it just kind of never changes. It changes over time. And so what that means is individuals and groups have some influence about what culture is and what it means. So into today's, in this week's lecture, we're kind of looking at culture through the lens of media, because media in today's world is a particular way that culture is disseminated and learnt. You'll remember in the weeks on socialization that kind of media consumption was seen as kind of a secondary level, a form of socialization. But like you could probably argue that media is increasingly maybe in the first level as kind of kids at an earlier age, are exposed to media or watching TV, Bluey or whatever, maybe in younger than they used to in the past. Some people argue that media itself now is culture, that we lead a kind of mediated media life. And so this has been increasingly the case and argued for the case in the last kind of 20, 30 years, and even more so since digital technologies have come to be quite dominant in our lives. Back in, say, the 50s and 60s, media was something that you kind of engage with on a kind of episodic basis. It wasn't something that you're kind of holding in your hand all the time through your phone. Media was a very one-way thing where you kind of watched it or consumed it. Increasingly today, media is much more kind of two-way and prosumptive. So in terms of this, what we're kind of looking at this week, though, we're kind of focusing more on that kind of old traditional media, and in the next week we'll look at digital media in more detail. And it's an important distinction to make because despite digital media being the kind of way we consume most things, much of the news and much of kind of pop culture itself is still kind of made in that kind of older culture industry rather than the digital industries. Although there's a kind of very much a convergence between those two things. So we think about old media here as like books, newspapers, films, TV, radio, new media being internet, mobile phones, digital media, and especially the kind of platforms that we're all engaged with now as well. There's mass media and niche media. Mass media being the stuff that most people are exposed to and consume, and niche media being more specialised things that kind of people can be interested in their day-to-day lives and that reflects their special interests. So certainly the media and the kind of growth of the media in terms of its importance in our lives has had kind of a multiplicity of effects. Marshall McLuhan argued in the 60s that we'd all be living in a kind of cooperative global village. The more and more we're exposed to each other's ways of life, we would understand each other more, and we'd be more convivial, and we would get along and like understand each other, and there'd be kind of more kind of happiness and satisfaction because of that. You would probably kind of point out that since then the opposite has happened. It seems more exposure to other cultures creates as much kind of conflict as it does in terms of agreement and learning. So the concept of the media is really important in sociology because we see it as a way that many people are exposed to other cultures, exposed to each other. Media is a way that people express themselves, and therefore it's a very important sociological object of study. There's also, in terms of the media, this notion of popular culture. And popular culture is something that's disseminated via the media, but it's also something we all participate in. So it's not just something we consume, people also participate in this stuff as well. So pop culture here is stuff like sport, music, fashion, video games, even you could argue things like going to the club or the beach are kind of elements of what pop culture is. You can see this in terms of the way that like these industries are so big. The gaming industry, I think now is the biggest pop culture. Things like music and fashion and TV and sport are huge billion-dollar, trillion-dollar industries. In Australia, for instance, we're a country that has sport as really central to our pop culture, and there's a lot of meanings and myths and legends around that kind of stuff. And you can see the way this kind of plays out with like New South Wales versus Victorian, rugby league versus AFL. The way that there's been this saying for years that being the Australian cricket captain is the second most important position in Australia after the Prime Minister and things like that. So pop culture is also this kind of way that cultural myths and legends are both disseminated and maintained over time. And these are very much kind of those storylines and narratives that we kind of learn from an early age. We get this stuff through media and pop culture, and it kind of really influences some of those scripts that we were talking about in terms of socialization in previous weeks. In terms of pop culture and consumption today, things like shopping, things like watching TV, and things like being on social media tend to be the key things that people do. And so what's interesting here is this kind of blurriness between doing things actively, like playing sport, and consuming things more passively, like watching sport. Pop culture encapsulates both those kind of things. I'm particularly been interested in pop culture in my own research, and I've done some research with young kind of punk and DIY cultures across the east coast of Australia in terms of how they bring their kind of punk sensibility, for instance, into making decisions about their careers and their lives. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, please look it up. And so you can think about the way culture works sociologically, I think, by thinking about specific examples. Something like alcohol consumption can really shed a light on all kinds of different aspects of culture. For instance, between different countries or different religions or whatever, there'll be different orientations towards alcohol, whether you can even consume it or not. In a place like Australia, alcohol is very central to much of our cultural activities. It's always been quite bizarre to me that like we celebrate Anzac Day with like everyone going to the pub and getting drunk. You can see the different class aspects of alcohol consumption, where the kind of more upper class wine discerning consumer versus the kind of more kind of beer swilling bogan that kind of is represented in pop culture a lot. See how central that alcohol is to sporting cultures in terms of its funding, in terms of maybe celebrating when you win. There's all kind of different sociological aspects that you can kind of uncover when thinking about something simple and everyday like alcohol consumption. And we can spread that wider to things like, why people may be particular fans of particular music, or why people dress in particular ways. So the media here disseminates kind of various norms. I'll get into kind of how we can decipher and interpret those things in the next part of the lectures. So from a sociologist's perspective, choosing an object of study, even as mundane, everyday things as like the furniture people choose or the cars people choose to drive, can reveal a lot about aspects of how culture works, how pop culture disseminates various norms and examples of way to live, and the way people kind of engage with that, either by taking it on board or being more resistive and critical towards it. Okay, I'll finish that part of the lecture there and come back in part 2 to talk about media and popular culture more specifically.